Hey, welcome to another episode of Real Integrative Medicine. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm the host of this podcast and YouTube channel. I'm so glad that you're here. Today we're going to talk about my own personal celiac diagnosis this summer, and I want to use it as an example of diagnostics and decision making. It's so common that by the time patients see someone in integrative medicine, they are frustrated by their diagnostic process. They feel like nobody knows what's wrong with them. They feel like they've tried a million things, or they feel like there is a secret special test that they're not getting access to, or they're not allowed to have in that conventional model. Those are often reasons why we seek integrative care in the first place, right? We're being disappointed over here. If someone's never seen an integrative practitioner, their awakening to that opportunity doesn't usually come when they're incredibly satisfied with their regular conventional care. It comes from dissatisfaction, right? It's dissatisfaction that drives them to become a consumer, to look at other options, to make a decision, to invest often with their own money in an idea or in a solution that hasn't been offered to them before. And so often, as a clinician working in integrative medicine, we have to balance the fact that people are incredibly dissatisfied in their care up until the point we meet them, but also make sure that all of the right boxes have been checked from a primary care perspective, and making sure that we're doing our due diligence with patients, which if patients are coming in the door and they're frustrated, asking them to wait or watch and wait or try something, or to try and convince them that a particular lab test maybe isn't that evidence-based or isn't really worth it, is really hard. Because remember, the person walked in the door with this idea that they've been wronged by their care, or that there is something they need, and we're not very good at accepting watchful waiting as the right thing to do. And we certainly don't like being sort of told that we shouldn't do a test or denied access to a test when we feel deeply like there's something wrong in our body and we want it to be checked out. So we always have this challenge in integrative medicine where we're trying to balance those two things. We want to meet patients' expectations around what their healthcare hasn't offered them up until this point, and we want to serve them in that way, but also we want to make sure that we are doing right by our patient. And sometimes the thing they brought in the door, the idea they brought in the door, is not evidence-based or is not the right thing for them to do. So I want to talk about that a little bit and how difficult that is, and I'm going to use my own celiac diagnosis as a great example, because sometimes we do want to throw the kitchen sink at you. Sometimes we do want to do a lot of testing, and we do want to try and figure out what the heck is going on with you in a non-linear way. Sometimes we need to look at what's happening in your body a bit more diagonally than the standard of care would maybe have us do. And my celiac diagnosis is an awesome example of this. So celiac is 1 to 2% of the population, depending on where your genetics are from. There's a couple of European ancestral lines that have a higher rate in the population than that, but generally we accept it's about 1 in 100 people have celiac. And the vast majority of those people have digestive symptoms when they show up on your doorstep, or they have other things that are kind of pointing very easily at celiac, like iron deficiency and other nutritional deficiencies. We see in children, we see failure to thrive, meaning that they're not growing or meeting their milestones from a growth perspective. We generally tend to think of celiac as being very digestive. There are absolutely people who have no digestive symptoms, but now we're talking about a fractional percent of a fractional percent, right? The number of people that have non-digestive symptoms as their first issue is low. So when we think about assessing people for conditions, we're trying, as your clinician, to use probability to decide, what do we think is going on? Is the test that we're about to run going to help us get clarity on that? And then after you have the test and after it's positive, what's the likelihood that it's true, right? So sometimes we imagine that every lab test is super accurate, but that's not actually the case. We have pre-test probability, meaning does it look like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it smells like a duck, right? It probably is a duck. We run the test to see if you're a duck. And then at the end, it says, yes, you're a duck. And we say, do we agree with the test, right? What's like the post-test probability that you truly are a duck? And I know that sounds like a silly example, but every lab test and every condition has overlapping potential. If 1 in 100 people with digestive symptoms have celiac, it means 99 people have other things. And so there's a lot to consider around probability when we're trying to make a diagnosis for something. My celiac is non-digestive. So I already was a fractional percentage of the people who have celiac. And the episode where this all came to light, I was starting to get to a bit of a breaking point in how I felt. We were running out of options, and the answer was starting to become, let's just wait and see. And I actually don't fault my practitioners for that being the answer. That, by all standards, was the right thing to do. And I'll walk you through this scenario in a second. But for me, as a consumer, we got to this crossroads where I was like, yeah, waiting is not really in my genetics. I would rather rule out some of the things that are the weird and wonderful or the less likely causes of my symptoms, to the very least put it to rest. And I really never expected any of my tests to come back positive, but was willing to explore and wanted to get some negative test results back so that I could move on and feel more comfortable with the watchful waiting. So I'll walk you through this scenario. Essentially, I woke up one morning, right? It was a beautiful August day, and I woke up with an itch right here on my thumb, and I'm pointing to the web of my thumb. And it was kind of like a bug bite. And I mean, if you live in Southern Ontario, it's not abnormal for you to have basically 1 to 2 million mosquito bites at any given time in the summer, especially if you spend any time up north. And I do. I have a cottage. I spend time in, the middle of Ontario, which is like black fly and mosquito central. So not abnormal to wake up with an itch. I then quickly got another itch on another spot in my hand, and they both looked like bug bites at the time. I wasn't particularly worried. It just annoyed me that it had pulled me out of sleep. If you've ever woken up itching or woken up with hives, it's so irritating, right? It feels like such an insult on your body for you to wake up with an itch like that. Go to work, right? Everything's fine. I go to work. And then while I was at work and having a cup of coffee, which is not a rare occurrence in my life, I got another hive. And we called them hives for a very long time, so I'm going to call them hives in this part of the story. So I got another hive on my arm while I was working, but I had a couple of unusual foods the night before. My kids were away, and so my husband and I were having all these pre-made gourmet meals from the grocery store that we didn't have to cook. So we had that. I also do have some unusual allergies. I've had anaphylaxis once in my life. We think it was to mold, but paprika was a close second. So I've had anaphylaxis once and had to go to the hospital and have EpiPen or Epi. I also have had occasional random hives. So now I have a hive on my arm. I started feeling like this whole body, adrenaline dump, essentially. And I couldn't tell if it was because I hadn't eaten enough and had a cup of coffee, or if I was having an allergic reaction. And that's what it felt like. It felt like I was heading down this path of an allergic reaction. I am one of those people, when my allergies get really bad, is that I get anxious. So histamine has, some really bizarre neurological effects. And when I have super high histamine, my first symptom for my anaphylaxis was actually a panic attack. It wasn't this, and then I got the swollen lips and all the things, but I had panic first. So I start having this panicky like feeling, take a Benadryl in the middle of the day. Like it was like 11 o'clock in the morning. And I'm also one of those people that when I take an antihistamine, I like want to go into a coma essentially with sleep. And it doesn't matter what kind, like whether it's like just an over-the-counter or Benadryl or what have you, I am basically put out by those medications. So I took an antihistamine while I was at work, but then continued to get some like random spots on my forearms, and it was mostly on my forearms. Drove home. We'll just leave that part out of the story since I just said that Benadryl makes me very drowsy. I made it home alive. And then over this series of about a week, continued to have this like progression of hives. I started to get crazy rashes between my fingers, and they were blistering, bubbling lesions between my fingers, as well as these like really significant welts on my forearms. And in one arm I have like almost totally tattooed, so it was difficult to see until I held it up like and got the angle of the light. But on my other arm it was really obvious that I had these like big huge welts. They were about the size of like a nickel or a quarter, and they weren't going away. So this was like the curious part of it, is that technically if something is hives related, the antihistamine would have like taken it down, or they would have started to rotate a bit, right? So that OG spot that was on my thumb, or the web of my thumb, never went away. So 4 days later, it's still there. So I consulted with a colleague of mine who's an MD, showed her, I took videos of it, of my skin, and sent them to her, and she actually thought that I had scabies. And so if you don't, like, scabies is like a mite, right? Like a skin mite. They burrow under the skin. They cause these like horrifying blisters, and it's itchy AF to have scabies. And so that's what we thought I had because it was between my fingers. And funnily, and this is where, and I promise that this story matters when we get to this part about thinking about diagnosis, we started to build an entire story around me having scabies. I had started training at a gym in a small town by my cottage. I had randomly used the chalk that was there, that was in this like, I don't know whose Ziploc bag. You can totally send shame my way, because why would I use some random person's chalk bag? But I did. And we started to build this entire story around the diagnosis. And we were like so sure that I had picked up this, communicable parasite essentially at a gym. Built a whole story around it. I did the full body insecticide treatment, which if you've never seen that or done that before, you essentially put like an insecticide cream like from here down, like neck down. And then you have to leave it on your body for 8 hours and then wash it off. So I did this. 2 days later, I still have new spots. I still am itchy. I'm like, okay, I must have the worst case of scabies that is on the earth, because it's not getting better. I did the treatment and nothing is happening. We then, as I was starting to progress, worse, and we're now at like day, I don't know, probably 13 of having, like since the original spot, it was just about 2 weeks, and it was feeling really out of control. The rashing was really out of control, and so was my itching. So we decided I took prednisone to try and just stop my immune system from doing whatever it was doing. Took a prescription strength anti-itch, which also made me go to bed, or made me want to go to bed, and waited, right? We waited to see if it went away with this prednisone. And in the middle of all of this is where I finally saw my primary practitioner, and the diagnoses started to get a little bit stranger. It started to be maybe of the worst case of poison ivy in the whole world. Maybe you touched some other plant. You live rurally, Jordan. Maybe you touched some plant and now your immune system has gone haywire. We'll just have to watch and wait to see what happens. I left at the doctor's office with another antihistamine prescription, with a cortisone cream prescription for the spots, and still the answer was wait. And you can see kind of as we were going through each step of my, potential diagnosis that we were really building a story around each possibility. And that's not wrong, right? Like we are trying to look for clues always. And so, yes, I live rurally. Yes, I don't wear gardening gloves and put my hands in all sorts of bushes. Yes, I have dogs that, in theory, and here I am Googling, can your dog give you poison ivy if they rolled in it? Turns out that's a very low percentage according to the internet, but we were essentially building all sorts of stories around these potential diagnoses, right? You must have got scabies from the gym, Jordan. You must have touched poison ivy. But really where we were was 14, 15 days in, prednisone in, many antihistamines in, cortisone cream in, and I felt exactly the same. Right? After all of that, I felt exactly the same physically, mentally. I felt hopeless. I felt hopeless. Nothing made them better. Nothing really made them worse. And I went in the sauna. I did all sorts of things that in theory you wouldn't do if you were having an allergic reaction. But truthfully, I had just become so frustrated by it by that point that I was well, F this, I'm going in the sauna. So nothing made it better. Nothing made it worse. We had tried all sorts of stories to figure out what was happening. I got to a point, essentially, where the answer was, we'll have to wait and see. Right? We'll have to wait and see. And for so many bizarro skin things, they do spontaneously resolve. We do see this resolution of allergies, of environmental contact sensitivities, all sorts of crazy stuff. We do see it resolve with time. There are so many cases of hives that we never learn the trigger, right? And if you've ever had hives, it is so difficult to retrace your steps and be oh, there was a little spice on this, flattened chicken that we bought from the grocery store. I wonder if that was it. You really will make yourself quite crazy trying to figure out what caused hives. So we were at this point where I was no better, probably a bit worse, actually. I had new crops still, over 2 weeks in, new crops of skin symptoms. They were blistering. The old spots had not gone away. They were still there, just as itchy. That original spot on my thumb was still there. I also started to get some on my neck. They were everywhere. And we had no answers. The answer was, we'll just wait and see. So for you, you probably have had this moment in your health journey where the answer is, we don't know. The answer is, let's just see what happens. And sometimes that's not wrong, right? Sometimes we do need some time to see what's actually happening with you, especially if part of your condition requires rehab, right? Physical rehab. There's definitely a wait and see. I mean, you certainly have to do your homework and do the things, but there's a wait and see aspect with physical rehab because we do need time. We need time to heal. There's a wait and see aspect when you start new medications, right? Every medication has a time frame for our tolerance of you not seeing improvement. And then if we don't see improvement beyond that, then we maybe need to change our mind, right? Great examples are things like antidepressants, right? We check in with patients at 2 weeks because we expect things to start to improve. We would never give it to you and say, let's wait and see how you are 2 years from now. Right? That would exceed our tolerance for us believing that drug was actually going to help you. So anytime we give you something, we have to wait a little bit. And being on the I'll say the giving and receiving end of healthcare, I know that sometimes us as patients are not that patient with that time, right? We say, hey, it takes X amount of days for your medication to work or for your nutrition plan to work. And patients are calling the next day saying, I don't feel any better, right? So we have to be mindful of that when we prescribe a solution, that there is time that we have to wait, and watchful waiting or waiting while we wait for your treatment to work is appropriate, right? And if in my case I had been in a watchful waiting time where things were starting to improve, or if I was on a medication that takes 2 weeks to work, right? If there had been something about the scenario that had made me feel like it was productive waiting, right? Productive waiting, then I maybe wouldn't have taken the approach that I took to find my celiac diagnosis. Productive waiting is important. It teaches your doctor what's working, what isn't. Sometimes it teaches us something about your diagnosis, right? There are things that spontaneously improve or get worse over time. And productive waiting and watching to see what happens in that predefined window, that helps you understand what's happening. I always say the biggest mistake you can make when your treatment plan isn't working is never going back to that first doctor. Because that they were expecting something at the end of that 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, too. And if you go back and nothing happened, it helps them get better at assessing you. It helps them actually understand what's going on with you. But because we're definitely in that like culture of cancel, if you go see someone and like their very first shot they take at your condition doesn't work, we never go back. And yet that might be the person who now gets to the answer of what's happening with you. Whereas if you try another doctor, now they get to have their first shot at it. Sometimes a second shot is the most important because we start to rule out, remember I said celiac, 1 in 100. We start to rule out all the other causes of hives. And we kind of did, right? Like over a 15-day window of time, we looked at allergies, we looked at scabies, we looked at all sorts of things. In those first 15 days, we were starting to like get down to, okay, the weird and wonderful are coming into play here. Like what else could it be? And so for you, when you are going through that diagnostic process, you have to go back to the first doctor, right? You have to go back and say, I still have it. It's still here. It didn't go away. I got 50% better, right? That's the kind of information that actually teaches your doctor what the next steps are. There is so much written in medicine and standards of care that involve time. Do this, then wait. Do this, then watch. Do this, observe. If us as patients, and I remember I was a patient in this situation, if us as patients are intolerant for waiting the appropriate amount of time, we're kind of making it difficult for everyone to do their best work, right? They said the medication took 2 weeks and we don't feel better by day 3, so we stopped taking it and now we're going to look something up on TikTok. That's not really fair. However, I was the patient. I was not getting any answers. The condition that I had was getting progressively worse when if it was any of the things that we thought it was, it should have been getting better. If it was allergies, it should have been better. I came home from the cottage. I was out of the scenario. If it was poison ivy, it should have been better. If it was scabies, it should have been better. I did the cream, okay? It should have been better, and it wasn't. It was getting worse. And what that meant was that I was at this point where either I could watch and wait or I could start to check some boxes on my own requisition. And that is exactly what I did. And this, I would say, is where integrative practitioners can be so valuable and so wonderful. Because in that moment, the conventional answer was take this antihistamine and let's see what happens when the season changes. While I continued to get progressively worse, they're not wrong. It just wasn't okay for me. This is when I got to make a consumer-based decision to say, give me that requisition. I don't care how much it costs. Let's check all the other things that cause itchy skin. So we checked some weird things, right? Vitamin D toxicity can sometimes cause weird itchy skin. So can elevated levels of bilirubin. We checked it. But the other one was celiac. Right? So celiac does have cutaneous manifestation, meaning that it can show up in the skin. There's a particular form called dermatitis herpetiformis that does show up in the skin. It's very unlikely. I don't have the genetics for celiac. I've checked. However, remember I said at the beginning that we'd built all these little stories around the possibilities. Maybe it was the Ziploc bag of gross chalk you used, Jordan. Maybe it was that you live on a farm, Jordan. The part of the story that we hadn't really built up enough is that I have had unusual autoimmune-like reactions in my skin for about 6 years. They are incredibly inconsistent However, the one summer in COVID, which of course it was in COVID, so I couldn't see anybody. I just took some pictures of it and never talked to anybody about it. But I developed like massive granulomas in my skin, which are these big, hard, they looked and felt like hot hives, but they were very hard to touch. It kind of like felt like touching a table in my skin. They lasted about 5 weeks and then they went away and I never had them again. I've had other on my face, that same thing. They show up kind of like a hive. They're super hot and very sensitive to touch. And I've always kind of called it like my rosacea, or because I have acne prone skin, I was willing to sort of brush off this other random face thing that I had going on and just call it something else rather than seeing it as maybe its own entity. When I realized, when I was finally staring at my lab tests that showed that I had celiac, I actually have had symptoms of autoimmune-like reactions in my skin for about 5 years. 0 digestive symptoms. And so the approach that I took for doing my own assessment was, let's rule out all the other random things that it could be. It cost me about $230 in lab work to check all of the boxes. I checked my blood sugar and a couple of other things at the same time. I hadn't been to the lab in a while, but mostly I was after like bilirubin, some of the vitamin deficiency toxicity stuff, and then looking at celiac. And then I also tested all of my immunoglobulins, like the IgA, etc. Again, what I didn't want was for me to waste that opportunity going to the lab. And if there was something that was showing up in my immune markers, I wanted to be able to take that piece of paper to my next doctor's appointment and not their answer be, well, let's test this, right? I wanted to eliminate a step as much as humanly possible. So as my lab started coming in and everything was normal, I was like, okay, well, here we are. I guess the answer is watchful waiting, and I'll continue to take this antihistamine and slather my body in cortisone cream. And then my final lab test came in and it was my celiac screen, and it was positive. And not just positive, it was like 120 times the upper limit positive. I stopped eating gluten on that day, which was about 2 months ago, and haven't had a symptom since. So there you go. I have skin manifestation of celiac disease. So part of why I wanted to tell you this story, and I think there's a couple of lessons embedded in here, but it gives you some food for thought, right? I took the check all the boxes approach. That's not always the right thing to do, okay? I'm the first person to say that that is not the right thing to do. You don't need to needle in a haystack your health. The person who's in front of you is also trying to help you and also trying to help rule out the most common reasons why you have your symptoms. We also sometimes do purposeful waiting, right? Waiting can be incredibly productive in medicine after we've given you something. If you have a self-limiting condition, productive waiting is incredibly productive. But also, there's moments where we're prescribed waiting and that just doesn't fit, right? We're prescribed waiting when we have been waiting, right? You've already been waiting 5 years, and waiting more doesn't feel good. There are some additional assessments that you would benefit from, and waiting is not the right thing. You're not that kind of girl. You'd rather just check all the boxes and get something checked, right? Maybe it doesn't fit if we're continuously trying to make up a story for why you have the symptoms you have. And what we haven't done is back up and actually look at those likelihood ratios. I will say patients get typecast all the time, right? If your primary doctor is treating you for anxiety and now you have palpitations, they're way likely to blame your palpitations on your anxiety rather than stepping back and looking at you from a clean slate. Sometimes you need to look at your whole case as a clean slate and start checking off those boxes on your requisition, right? That actually might help rule things out for you. Remember, everything in medicine is just probability and stats. It's kind of your decision and your doctor's decision if those stats matter. If 1 in 100 sounds like a lot of people, then check for celiac, right? If it fits. If 1 in 10,000 doesn't sound like a lot of people, let's not start there. And sometimes in integrative medicine, we do. Right? Sometimes we start at that weird and wonderful, and that doesn't actually help ensure that you're getting the primary care that you deserve. So what I want you to take away from this episode, one, is that you are a consumer, right? You get to decide how you want your healthcare to look. If your doctor's suggesting watchful waiting, ask them when to expect this phase to be over. How will you know if it's working, right? If this watchful waiting is productive, how will we know? And what are the next steps when the waiting is over? If the steps can be done now and help you save time or suffering, I don't know, maybe that's a good time to do it. But sometimes waiting is important and waiting is helpful. And like I said earlier, when you're done waiting, if you're unsatisfied with how you're feeling, make sure that you go back to that original practitioner and tell them, because now they know a lot more about your case, way more than that brand new doctor down the street that you're going to try with next. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. The moral of the story is that you need to send me all the gluten-free recipes that you own, because I'm deeply missing really tasty bread. Thanks for listening.